just to kill time. My boss, Joe Keeble, is going to be introducing our speaker today.
Thank you, Heather. It's great to see everybody on the call. It is great to be back with our seminar series. We took a little break in the fall, and this is actually our first seminar for the spring. And so it's great to be back with our seminar series. And I'm really excited about the seminar today. I'm really excited to see the face that's here in our seminar today. Let me tell you about the seminar today, which is part of our slate of programming today that is discussing, the career landscape for people with PhDs in the behavior and brain sciences. And as part of that larger program, we've dedicated the seminar today to someone who represents the kinds of careers, who is going to tell us about her work and represents the kinds of careers that people with PhDs in the behavioral and brain sciences can go on to. So our seminar speaker today is Ranjani Kirtane. Ranjani got her undergraduate degree at Brown and then did a PhD here at the University of Pennsylvania, working with someone who many of you know, Sharon Thompson-Schill. And has subsequently gone on to a career doing really interesting things in the startup and research world. After her PhD, her first job was as the director of business operations and behavioral science at a startup called NAC. And as part of that role, she was responsible for working with customers, ensuring customer satisfaction, building relationships with customers, and leveraging those insights to improve NAC's products. She is now the director of research at an organization called Helio Campus. They are an analytics company who does benchmarking and decision support to help institutions, including institutions of higher education. And so as director of research, she's responsible for overseeing analyses, determining the insights from those analyses, and providing those insights to Helio Campus's benchmarking consortium. And as part of that, has been doing a lot of research on trends in higher education. This is the topic of her talk today, which is academia from a different perspective, researching trends in higher education. I'm really excited to hear this from many directions, and it's great to see you again, Ranjani. It's been many years, so thanks for coming back and doing this, and I look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Joe. It's great to see you again, too. And I'm really honored to be invited to speak with you all today. So what I had planned for today was to first just start off by talking about my path, my career path and the twists and turns that it took, and just to get to the point where I am today. And what I also have prepared to speak with you about is basically what I do at Helio Campus, expanding on the description that Joe provided, and also to share some of the research that we've done at Helio Campus on trends in higher education. And I can say that being at different universities, I didn't really think at all, very much at least, while I was at those universities, about how the universities are being run from more of a business perspective, and what that means in terms of staffing. And it's a really interesting time to be in higher education. There's a lot of headlines that you've likely seen about financial pressures that universities are facing. And so what I can share is what are some of the trends that we're seeing across the institutions that we work with, and what are some of the questions that those institutions, universities, colleges are trying to answer through data, and what are the types of data that we provide to the members of our benchmarking consortium. So let me actually stop sharing. And what I'll do first, as I mentioned, is just kind of talk about my path. And so as Joe mentioned, so I got my undergrad degree at Brown in neuroscience. I went on to get a PhD in psychology from Penn. And after that, I did 2 postdocs. So I did a postdoc at Yale, and then I did another postdoc at the National Institutes of Mental Health. And while I was doing those postdocs and thinking about, what's going to be my next step after this, if you had asked me in grad school, what do you do as a PhD for a career outside of academia, the only word that came to mind was industry, and I didn't know what that meant, and so what I learned, basically what I did in order to find out more about what does industry mean, what types of jobs are available to PhDs who are considering options outside of academia, what I did was to talk to essentially a lot of people. So friends of friends, and I had friends in the program, the psych program at Penn, who actually had gone on to pursue careers outside of academia. So some areas that I actually learned the names of and learned what they do were fields like user experience research. I learned about learning scientists, research scientists. If you were at the panel that was right before this talk, you might have learned about, policy, folks who work, setting policy and thinking about policy decisions. And there's really a rich world out there of careers outside of academia. So this was a big learning experience for me, just in terms of learning about what are the types of careers that you can pursue. And there are a lot of aspects of academia that I found appealing, but in talking to contacts and talking to friends about the careers that they had pursued outside of academia, there's a lot that appealed there as well. And one of the main things that I learned, my initial reaction when thinking about careers outside of academia was, well, I don't know how to do that. What I know how to do is neuroimaging research. What I know how to do is designing behavioral experiments. I don't know anything about, careers outside of academia. But what I came to learn through, folks call these like informational interviews, really, trying to gain information about what people do on a daily basis in their jobs. What I learned is that in grad school, what you're getting is a foundation in a lot of transferable skills. So yes, what I knew was designing behavioral experiments. What I knew was analyzing neuroimaging data. But really, if you break that down, what I had gotten a foundation in graduate school was just analyzing data, dealing with large data sets, applying principles of statistics to figure out what's interesting about the data, communicating the data to different audiences, whether that's through written publications, whether that's through presenting the data in conference presentations or just talks in the department. This is all really valuable experiences that you're getting that are completely transferable to a variety of jobs outside of academia. So that helped me think about my academic CV and how that could be translated into a resume in terms of skills that I actually possess that, to be quite honest, I hadn't really thought about them as skills that are transferable. So as I was trying to think about this decision of which path to pursue in my personal life, I had gotten married and my husband got a job at a startup out in San Francisco. So we decided to move to San Francisco, and I decided to take a risk and I worked at a startup based in Palo Alto, actually. And this was completely unfamiliar territory to me. Really all I had known was the postdoc and the grad student life, but it was a great learning experience. So really throughout that process of working at NAC, what I did was to build on those transferable skills that I had developed a foundation in graduate school, but also expanded upon them. So, NAC is a company that makes mobile games that are rooted in principles of cognitive science, psychology. And the goal of those games is for companies to use them to bring a more objective lens into the hiring process. So rather than just interviewing candidates and getting subjective thoughts about whether a candidate might be good for a job, using the output of these games to get a sense of what are their personality traits, what are their cognitive abilities. So my role at NAC was working with folks within the company and working with data scientists, for example, and helping to explain the science behind the games to customers, to companies that were interested in implementing the games. So through that process, some skills that I developed and built on were learning how to explain science and data to folks that don't necessarily have a science or a data background, kind of getting more of a foundation and learning how to visualize data to appeal to a broad variety of audiences. And working at a startup, this was like an 8 to 10 person startup, so it's pretty scrappy. And you wear a lot of different hats. So you sometimes will be wearing a marketing hat, sometimes you're wearing a product management hat. And that gave me a lot of experience with a variety of different roles within a company. So that is one advantage. If any of you are thinking about what a startup can be like, for this particular startup, that was an exciting aspect of it. I got to learn about a lot of different parts of the company. With that how there can be some challenges with working at a startup, depending on how stable that startup is I guess the best way I can put it. So the particular startup that I was at the time, was bootstrapped, no venture capital funding. And so it was really financially unstable, to be quite honest. And while there was a lot of skills and a lot of experience that I gained that was valuable, the financial instability, that's a real consideration. And so after about 2.5 years of living in San Francisco, at that point, my husband and I, we were in a 700 square foot apartment and had a 10-month-old. And we kind of reached the end of our road in San Francisco and realized that, it was kind of time for us to move back east. And when we did move back to the East Coast, I was looking for another job. And I came across a company. We moved, so I'm currently based in Cary, North Carolina. And in my research of companies in the Research Triangle in North Carolina, I came across a company called Academic Benchmarking Consortium. And this was another startup, but what I found interesting about this company was it's a completely different space, but speaking to this point about having transferable skills, if you know how to analyze data and you know how to visualize data and you know how to communicate data, you can do that across a variety of different industries. And so Academic Benchmarking Consortium is in the higher education analytics space, so completely different industry. But again, I had a lot of these transferable skills that served me well at this company as well. And so I started my path at Academic Benchmarking Consortium, or ABC, as a client services manager. But given my interest in data and research, I kind of moved over to the data and research side. And ABC had a very different trajectory as a startup compared to NAC, in that ABC was acquired about 1.5 years ago by Helio Campus. And Helio Campus has since acquired another company that's in the learning assessments and student outcomes space. So it's been interesting to have two very different startup experiences, but both very valuable in terms of the skills and experiences that I've gained. So with that, let me jump to a little bit about what it is that I do at Helio Campus, what my role is, and then also kind of what I've been finding interesting in working in the higher education analytics space. So with my role as Director of Research at Helio Campus, my primary functions involve working with the institutions that are in our benchmarking consortium. And I have a few slides to show you kind of who's in the consortium. And what we do essentially is to provide analytics to universities to help them better understand their staffing across a variety of different administrative and academic functions at the university. So let me move to my next slide. Looks like it's frozen. 1 second. All right. So what this slide is showing you is a little bit about the trajectory of these companies. So both of them, interestingly, spun out of universities. So Academic Benchmarking Consortium was founded out of UNC Chapel Hill, spun out as a startup. And Helio Campus grew out of University of Maryland Global Campus. And both of these companies essentially merged. Helio Campus acquired ABC, and as I mentioned, acquired another company recently to expand the services and the capabilities that are offered. So here's kind of a one-sentence description of what we do at the Benchmarking Consortium. So what we do is to measure the human capital investments. Specifically, we're looking at total cash compensation or labor spend, labor FTEs or full-time equivalents, in activities that are required to deliver on the mission of an institution and to compare them internally across their institution and externally against their benchmark institutions. And this idea of benchmarking has been something that is a little bit newer, at least from a standardized perspective across multiple institutions. And it really grew out of healthcare. So when Academic Benchmarking Consortium, or ABC, was started, the founder of ABC actually came from doing benchmarking in healthcare and wanted to apply the same benchmarking type analyses to the higher education space. And typically, the folks that we're interacting with at our member institutions are the chief financial officer, the chief business officer, and it can involve working with human resources and institutional research or IR staff as well. And just to speak a little bit about kind of the problem that ABC and Helio Campus have been trying to solve. So typically when it comes to staffing at universities, there are several forces that can come to play in making those types of decisions. So there can be anecdotes, there can be emotion, as well as politics. And the goal of Helio Campus is to bring data to the conversation in order to help decision makers at universities have that data to help support their decisions. One of the ways that the tool is used is, we call it a myth buster. There could be myths about whether a particular function at an institution has is under-resourced or over-resourced, but what we're able to do is actually bring data to bear to help address those types of questions. And the reason that this is important is that when you look at, what an institution is spending, a large percentage of what an institution is spending just to operate is going towards the people. So the staff, the faculty that basically it takes to run a university. So this map here gives you a sense of the types of institutions that are in the Helio Campus Benchmarking Consortium. So we serve 80 active member institutions across 35 states and Canada. And you can see with the table, that should show up soon. There we go. You can see the makeup of these 80 institutions. So the majority of the institutions that we serve are public institutions. We do have some private institutions, and there's one government institution as well. And then in terms of the research intensity of the institutions, most of the universities and colleges that we serve are R1, so more research intensive, although we do have some variety. We've got some R2s and other Carnegie classification universities as well that are in the consortium. So what do we do? So what I'd like to do with the next couple of slides is just to give you a sense of the types of data that I'm analyzing that the company is providing to the members that are in our benchmarking consortium. So as I mentioned, we focus on measuring human capital investment across member institutions. Essentially what we do is we take a data file that's provided by the universities. This is essentially a payroll file where we're getting all of the internal human capital investment data from a university. And then what we do is to also collect additional sources of information. So for example, we collect material external labor. So institutions typically have services that are contracted out. That might be a dining contract, it might be a maintenance contract, et cetera. So we collect all of that information as well. How much is being spent on those contracts? How many staff are involved in providing the services associated with those contracts? And we also collect what we call analysis factors. And what these are really are different ways to normalize the data. So we collect, for example, the number of students, the number of employees, the magnitude of the research expenses, or put another way, what is the total number of externally sponsored research dollars that are coming into the university? And the reason that that can be useful is when you're thinking about, at one particular institution, say, how many student services staff do they have per student? When you want to compare against another comparable university, you want to be able to have those analysis factors to normalize so that you're normalizing by, say, the student population. Or in the case of research administration, some of our institutions are interested in finding out, for the size of their research administration staff, how many staff does it take to administer, a certain number of externally sponsored research dollars? And how does that staffing metric compare to other comparable institutions? So the reason that we're able to benchmark is that we take all of this data and we map it into what we call our standard activity model. And I have a slide coming up that will give you more information about what exactly that is. We map all of the data into this standard activity model, and then what we do is to essentially digest it and identify what are the interesting findings, what are the insights from the data. And again, here's an example where, this is something that you do throughout grad school, something that I did throughout my postdocs, throughout my prior startup experience, is really finding what's the so what of the data, what's interesting, and then communicating that back to our member institutions. So here is a graphic showing you our standard activity model. And these are all of the functions across the university that we capture in this standardized framework. Most of the activity areas that we have in our model are focused on administrative functions. And the benchmarking consortium really grew out of institutions trying to better understand their administrative costs. So you might have heard in the news this term administrative bloat. This is something that institutions have been concerned about for quite a while in terms of, what is the level of administrative staffing that is required to run the university? And there has been criticism that institutions have been adding, essentially maybe more administrators than what is required. And, there's a lot of politics around that. But what we're able to do through our data is to show what the level of administrative staffing is for institutions, and then how that compares to comparable or benchmark institutions. So we've got functions like communications, development, facilities, finance, general administration, human resources, information technology, research administration, and student services. And you can see that within each of these activity areas, we break the data down at the sub-activity level as well. So within communications, we can provide benchmarking data on, marketing and communications and public affairs. And we've got various sub-activities, as you can see, for each of the activity areas that are shown here as well. We recently, kind of based on feedback from the membership, also expanded the model to start looking into academics. So what we've done there is to look at different faculty types for our institution in terms of, tenure/tenure track faculty, lecturers and other faculty, professional researchers, and we can do some benchmarking for institutions there as well. Another aspect of the data that we analyze is where on campus these functions are occurring. So oftentimes, given that our chief stakeholder is the CFO and often the budget office at the institution, often they have a good sense of where the centralized functions are occurring and how they're staffed centrally. So for example, how many staff are in their central HR office? How many staff are in their central finance office? But what they might not have as good of a window into is how are these functions being performed out in the non-centralized, or rather the decentralized units. So typically that's your academic units or schools. And what we find for our members is that often there are these large pockets of decentralized investments where not only do you have, for example, accountants in your centralized finance office, but you have accounting functions that are happening out in your academic units. And knowing kind of what is your total accounting investment across the institution, both centralized and decentralized, might not be data that the institution readily has a handle on, much less being able to compare that to other institutions as well. Some other classifications that we have are, shared services. That would be investments or labor spending that serves more than one unit or school, but not the entire campus. And I mentioned that we capture external labor as well. This slide just tells you a little bit more about the data that we're getting in the data file. So primarily we are collecting information about employees at the employee level, what department they're in, what division they're in, and also critically what they do. So what is their job title, what is their classification, and what they're being paid. So what's their base pay, what's their supplemental pay. And our team does research in order to identify for employees that are in that data file, what are their job responsibilities? And that's mapped to our standard activity model. So a couple of skills that I've picked up along the way that have been useful in analyzing the data. So at NAC, I got some experience working with SQL. So that has proved to be very valuable in terms of being able to manipulate data, analyze data. And if I could kind of talk to a previous version of myself and think through what are the courses that I wished I had taken earlier on. I think certainly learning SQL, I think learning a programming language would have really become useful for me. So, Python, basically, if you know a programming language and you know how to manipulate data and you know how to visualize it, kind of as I mentioned earlier, that will serve you well across a variety of different careers. And those are skills that I've kind of picked up in bits and pieces along the way. But if you are already picking up those skills as a grad student, it's really going to pay off for you. If you want to be analyzing data, but outside of the academic path, I think it's really going to set you up well for success. So a few different ways that our members are using the data. And as I mentioned earlier, given that institutions are facing a lot of financial pressures, and this is even before the onset of the pandemic, given that a lot of the institutions that are in the benchmarking consortium are public institutions, some of the challenges that they're facing are, limited state appropriations. And across the country, we've been seeing headlines about how there's declines in student enrollment. So there's a decrease in, tuition revenue. With the pandemic, there's been a decrease in revenue from other sources as well, auxiliary units that are on campus. So essentially, the institutions that are in the benchmarking consortium are trying to use data to better understand how they're staffed. Are they staffed optimally? Are they staffed in such a way that they're achieving efficiency while also providing effective services on campus? And the types of analyses that we provide to the institutions that are in the benchmarking consortium are really trying to provide those types of answers to them. So some of the ways in which members use the data are identifying what are some areas within that standard activity model where they might have a higher staffing intensity compared to benchmark institutions. And that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. You might have a higher staffing level compared to benchmark institutions because you're trying to deliver a higher level of service. It might be because you've got some strategic initiatives at the institution that are really trying to achieve certain target goals. But without having the data, it's really difficult to be able to evaluate whether you're staffed optimally or really to be able to plan for the future. That breakdown of centralized versus decentralized investments, that's often helpful for institutions to get a better picture of where their staffing is occurring on campus. And many of our institutions use the data when it comes to budget planning for the future. Being a benchmarking consortium, another really valuable aspect of the consortium is that it is also a community of institutions so that they can connect with each other to kind of talk through best practices and learn from each other's experiences about what they found in terms of not only using the data that Helio Campus provides, but also just in terms of other challenges that they might be facing more generally. And here I just have a few use cases and some institutions, aligned with those use cases in terms of how they're using the data. So, I've already spoken to this a little bit, but just kind of broad categories of use cases. So targeting administrative areas for strategic budget allocations, using the data internally for conversations with senior leadership or accrediting boards, looking at academic units specifically to evaluate resource allocation, and data-driven staffing decisions. So what I wanted to do next was to just show you some of the types of data that we provide in the consortium. And before I do that, I just wanted to ask a general question, just see kind of what the intuitions were in the audience. As I mentioned earlier, as a grad student, as a postdoc, I gave little thought to how the institution runs, certainly from a financial perspective, but I just wanted to see if anyone, feels like, sharing in the chat or, just speaking up, what percentage of operating expenses at your institution or at an institution in general would you think would go towards investments in people? Does anybody have a guess that they want to put forth? All right, I'm seeing some guesses, 70%, 60%, maybe 50%. All right, great. So what we found from our research in the consortium is that about 50% of operating expenses goes towards human capital investments or spend on people across different university size categories. So you can see the orange here, that's human capital investments. And then we also broke this down by different university size categories. And you can see that regardless of the university size category, it's roughly around 50%. So the next question I'll ask is, so now that we've established, it's about 50% going towards people spend, if you had to estimate what percentage of that people spend do you think would go towards administrative people spend? So not talking about, professors, anybody doing teaching research service, purely administrative functions. Anybody have a guess there? All right, I'm seeing some guesses of 30%, 40%, 80%. So those are all good guesses. And what we're showing you here is data from the consortium. And again, this is going to differ by institution, but what I'm presenting here is just on average, about 38%, so close to 40%, whoever guessed that, good for you, goes towards administrative costs. So you can see here with this pie chart breakdown, this is on average, we're seeing about 52% going towards academic staff, 38% going towards administrative staff, and this 10% that's excluded, those are areas that are outside of administrative and academic staff at the institution. So for example, some things that would be included in that that we don't capture are like healthcare professionals at the institution. So here you can see that unlike the previous slide, the university size actually does play a significant role in terms of that administrative intensity. So this is essentially where we're taking the total spend on administrative staff and dividing that by the total labor spend of the institution. And we call that our administrative intensity measure. And you can see here that the smallest institutions tend to have the highest administrative intensity measure, whereas the large institutions tend to have the lowest administrative intensity measure. And that kind of makes sense. Large institutions, often these are large research institutions where they have a significantly higher number of researchers, academic staff at the institution. Our smallest institutions tend to be smaller in that category, but there's also a certain number of fixed costs that smaller institutions just need to have in order to be able to, run the institution. You need to have HR, you need to have finance. So those smallest institutions do tend to have a higher administrative intensity when it comes to people costs. So I'll share with you, and I just want to keep an eye on time to make sure I'm not rambling on too much. I'll share with you a couple of research findings that we have shared with our consortium members with some topics that have been of primary interest to them. So I talked earlier about how one of the aspects of the data that we analyze are what we're looking at is essentially how centralized is an institution. And the reason that this has become more a topic of interest for our members and for institutions in general is that there are some pros and cons associated with centralization, and that can have impacts on your the efficiency and the effectiveness of the administrative services that are provided. So if you look at some of the potential advantages of centralization, and so again, to come back to that accounting example, this would be if you had a purely centralized accounting function, that would be all of your accountants are sitting out in your, your central finance office. If you have a more decentralized accounting model, that would mean that, yes, you're going to have some centralized accounting, but you're also going to have some accountants that are sitting out in your academic units as well. So what are some potential advantages of centralization? It can be more cost effective. You can achieve more economies of scale. It might allow you to have a more coherent strategy. There can be more information sharing. There can be less competition amongst different units. But there are also some potential disadvantages. By having just a centralized office, there can be less personal engagement, less fluidity, agility, lower levels of trust, and there's a potential for a decline in quality. Levels of centralization certainly differ depending on the different budget models of universities. Universities have, a variety of different budget models. Some tend to be more centralized, some tend to be more decentralized, where there's more autonomy that's given to academic units in terms of being able to, say, make their own, being able to hire their own finance staff, hire their own HR staff, and having more responsibility over their own budgets. So what we did was to look at some trends in centralization across our consortium members with this research study. And the first question that we tackled was how centralized are different administrative activity and sub-activity areas, in fiscal year 20 across the consortium. And what we found was that facilities and student services tend to be the most centralized activity areas. Communications and finance tend to be the least centralized activities. So those are areas where you do tend to have more communications and finance staff that are sitting out in the academic units. But centralization does vary by activity, and it can vary by university size. Your smaller institutions are going to tend to be more centralized, just given you're dealing with a smaller population of employees and students. Your larger institutions are going to tend to be more decentralized in general. We also looked to see what are some trends over time. So we looked over a 3 fiscal year period and found that finance and HR sub-activities have tended to increase the most in centralization over that time period. We also looked at the impact of centralization on administrative staffing levels. And what we found is that if you look across the institution, higher centralization in finance, HR, facilities, and communications sub-activities tend to be associated with leaner staffing levels. And we also looked out in the academic units and found that the student services sub-activities of registration and admissions tend to be central drivers of administrative leanness. And, throughout our conversations with our members, one aspect that we tend to emphasize, and this goes back to, trying to pull out what's interesting for the members while also trying to provide them with the appropriate caveats of how to interpret the data, And, going back to transferable skills, that's something that you do as a grad student when you're, writing up your findings. What you're doing is trying to say what's interesting, but also, what are some caveats to keep in mind. So it's kind of the same principle, but in a very different space here with this, with these research and topics and with the data. But what we try to emphasize to our members is that, being leaner is not necessarily better. So the goal of the benchmarking data that we provide is not necessarily for institutions to use it as evidence for, cutting staff or trying to become administratively more lean. That may be appropriate in some situations, but another very important aspect of all of this is what is the effectiveness of the services that are being provided. So we always encourage our member institutions to keep both efficiency and effectiveness in mind when they're thinking about the data and using the data for planning purposes. Just keep an eye on time. So the area of research that I wanted to share a little bit with you about was relationships between student services investments and student outcomes. So why is this topic, interesting or top of mind for institutions and for higher education in general? So, again, if you've been, kind of reading the news about, higher education related articles, there's been a lot of concerns about the cost of higher education and student debt. And there are a lot of questions being asked about, what is the effectiveness? What's the return on investment of a college education? And with these financial pressures that institutions are facing, they're also looking to increase not only the effectiveness of their services, but also to the efficiency of student services. So essentially trying to do more with less. So what we did with the data, given that student services is a component of our standard activity model, what we did was to look at the level of investment in student services functions for our member institutions, and then to look at the relationship between those levels of investment and student outcomes. So in particular, we were looking at student outcomes such as retention rates and graduation rates. And I'll share with you here the key findings from that research. What we were looking at first was, if you look at student services functions, which are the functions within student services where we see institutions really allocating most of their resources. In general, when we look across the administrative functions, student services tends to be the highest area of investment. So compared to, say, finance, research, administration, et cetera. Within student services, admissions, academic advising, these tend to be the highest areas of allocation when it comes to people spend and staffing. If you look from FY18 to FY20, again, against this 3 fiscal year period, and you think about, well, what might be the student services areas that have increased the most? Perhaps unsurprisingly, diversity is the area where we see the most growth in, people spend, staffing investments over that time period. And I expect we'll continue to see that in future fiscal years as well. So the key question that we were trying to address is there this relationship between student services investments and student outcomes? And essentially, yes. So when we look at the relationship between those variables, we do find a positive correlation. And even when you control for the characteristics of the student population, like standardized test scores, member selectivity, higher investments in academic advising were related to, higher student retention rates. And there's likely a lot of factors at play here. There's a lot of key differences between institutions that have to be kept in mind. We also looked at, are there levels of centralization that are related to student outcomes? And there was no real clear picture that emerged from the data there. The last topic that I will share with you in terms of the types of research that we've been doing at Helio Campus is related to trends in student mental health and wellness staffing. And with the onset of the pandemic, there has been even more of a focus on this topic. But even before the pandemic, there has been a real student mental health crisis that's been developing. So, I've got some statistics here that I'll run through, but if you look at college students' mental health over the past decade, 1 in 3 report having a mental health disorder, 1 in 4 take psychiatric medication, the rates of depression have more than doubled. And, as I mentioned, this has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. So if you look at the fall of 2020 compared to the fall of 2019, there's definitely been an increase in the number of students that have been seeking mental health services and reporting a negative impact of the pandemic on their mental health. And in addition to the experiences of the students, facing these mental health issues, there's definitely a clear impact on student outcomes as well. So students with mental health problems, twice as likely to leave an institution. And with the onset of the pandemic, these effects are only going to be multiplied going forward. There's also impacts on employees as well. So college and university mental health clinics seeing an exodus of mental health professionals, counselors and mental health clinics are feeling burnt out. So there's staffing issues there, and these are all problems that institutions are grappling with. So what can we show from the data in the benchmarking consortium to try to shed some light on what are some trends that we're seeing in terms of the data when it comes to student mental health and wellness staffing? So some key takeaways here, we surveyed our membership just to get a sense of what are the types of initiatives that they're undertaking to try to address some of the mental health challenges that they're facing on their campuses. And by administering this survey, unsurprisingly, student mental health is a hot topic across institutions. We find that they have been increasing their staffing even prior to COVID-19. And what we also learned was, got some qualitative data essentially on what the types of initiatives are. So there's some that are just increasing the level of services. There's increased telehealth and online platforms that are being leveraged. Some are using a peer education model, given that students are often the first line of support for other students that are in crisis. And this is where the benchmarking consortium as a community of institutions is particularly important in terms of being able to share information with each other about what they're finding to be effective. With the labor spend and the staffing data that we have from our members, what we were able to show was that in fiscal year 20, if you look at differences between different size institutions and how they're staffing when it comes to student mental health, the smallest institutions in the consortium tended to invest the most, whereas institutions that are smaller tended to invest the least. If you look at how staffing has been changing over the past 3 fiscal years, we see that large and smaller institutions have had the largest increases when it comes to labor spend and FTEs on student mental health and wellness. And we looked to see, do we find a relationship between the level of staffing at student mental health and wellness and student outcomes? And what we found was, yes, there is a positive correlation between the level of investment in student mental health and wellness and better or higher student retention rates, but there's a whole range of factors that are likely at play. And it's retention, student mental health, both very complicated and tricky questions to explore. And so there's just a lot that has to be taken into account when thinking about relationships there. So with that, I've been talking for a very long time, so I will pause, but I definitely want to open it up for questions if anybody has any for me.
Thank you, Ranjani. So let's open it up for questions. I think questions, given the theme of the day, could be of the form about your career path or advice along those lines, or about the presentation and trends in higher education. So I think either of those, we're happy to entertain questions in either of those areas. People can, if you want to raise your hand and unmute, we can let you ask questions that way, or for folks who want to put the question in the chat, we can also take the questions that way. So Andrea, you have a question.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. That was really interesting. So as a postdoc who works with behavioral methods and I think has some experience with data analysis and visualization, as you were, even though not at the neuroscience level, My question is kind of very practical, but I think at the same time, potentially relevant to a lot of people here. So it is clear that those are transferable skills, as you convincingly show. My question is, how much adjustment, how much more, or much extra training did you have to undergo, if any at all, to learn the most effective ways of doing data analysis and visualization in this particular type of job, as opposed to when we have to test an hypothesis for writing a scientific paper? So are there differences? And if there are, what, could you just talk about the type of adjustment and transition you have to go through in that sense?
Sure, that's a great question. I think one of the adjustments that I had to make wasn't necessarily in the types of analyses I was doing, but in terms of communicating that responsibly to the audience. So what I found, outside of academia is that folks aren't thinking about significance. they aren't thinking about p-values necessarily. I mean, they are thinking about significance in the sense that, they want a robust result, but they're not thinking about it in, as a grad student, as a postdoc, I was very focused on, what's the noise in the data? What's my p-value telling me? But I think outside of academia, and also I had those to show as evidence, right? But outside of academia, there's more that comes into translating the science to folks that are not necessarily interested in thinking of the data that way, and thinking about how you want to communicate what the data is saying and not saying. But there's more of an onus on you, or I felt it on me, in order to pull out what I thought of as a significant result to share. And also, with dealing with external customers, external stakeholders, whether that's people internal to the company or outside, people want to use data to tell a story. And so I think being able to set parameters, and this is where it's useful having the training in graduate school or being a postdoc, in terms of what are the data really saying and what are they not saying, but then being able to communicate that to a non-scientific audience. So it's kind of a long way of saying that I think is a lot of the learning that I had. I think initially when I started out doing research at Academic Benchmarking Consortium, I was very focused on what's the p-value telling me, and trying to communicate that. But I realized that, the chief financial officer doesn't want a p-value from me. What they want is, what is interesting about this data and what can I use it for? I'll also say that in terms of additional training, I think what's been useful to me at Helio Campus, it's been a real education in the space, the higher education space. So there's been a lot of content knowledge that I've picked up on. And for me personally, I hadn't interacted with Tableau before, a data visualization tool. I mentioned SQL earlier. These are some skills that I picked up that I hadn't necessarily used as a grad student or as a postdoc, because they just weren't relevant to the work I was doing. But what I've found is that they have broad applicability across a variety of different industries. Does that help to address your question?
Sure. I mean, I guess it's something that we could talk about, for a very long time, but that's a really, really insightful, way of thinking about it. Yeah, thank you.
Yep, sure. So I see a question here. Ooh, these are great. So I'm seeing, could you tell us about your work-life balance experience outside of academia? And related to that, some of the panelists earlier talked about negative aspects of doing a PhD. Do you know anyone working on this area to collect and understand data on how academic research is done and how to change the system? So those are both great questions. I'll turn to the first one first, so work-life balance. This was, when I mentioned earlier that I was thinking about options both within and outside of academia, this is something that I think definitely played into my decision. I think I caught the tail end of the last session where, I heard someone talking about when you're doing research, when you're in grad school, when you're a postdoc, you're kind of thinking about your research all of the time. And I found for myself personally that I did not have a good work-life balance as a postdoc, as a grad student. And one thing that I've really appreciated in my roles outside of academia is that for me personally, I have had a better work-life balance. For the most part, with my current role, there are cases where I have to work evenings or I have to work weekends, but for the most part, I don't. And I really enjoy that. And that's not to say that you can't have a career in academia where you do have a good work-life balance. Lots of people make it work. Lots of people enjoy it. Just for me personally, I found that the work-life balance was better for me in my roles outside of academia. So that's something that I've really valued. The second question. Yes, so I have seen some research that has been done looking at the mental health of students that are in graduate school, and certainly the pandemic has negatively affected that, but just graduate school in general and impacts on mental health. I'm certainly not an expert in that area, but I know that there is research being done on that. And yeah, I think the goal there really is to identify how to, potentially, change the system in order to make it less isolating and to build, in more community and to try to change that. But yeah, so I guess the short answer is I know that there is work being done there, but I'm not too familiar with what's being found.
Okay. Other questions?
I could probably actually have maybe the one question. I'm just curious too, because so what about, is there a sense of from your research of what could be some real troubling signs? I mean, we've been talking a long time in higher ed about there will eventually be some institutions that are closing, but we really haven't seen it. But it does feel like maybe we're approaching the tipping point. And also the technology has changed so that maybe in-person learning. So it looks like there could be some shifts in the number of institutions that are operating. Do you have a sense of what might be the indicators? And that would be for people who are actually thinking about maybe pursuing jobs in academia. Is there something that you think would be maybe a worrying sign to maybe this might not be, if you're looking for a tenure track position, this may not be the place that's going to be around in 20 years?
That is a really good question. I think that with the topic of administrative bloat, I think that administration has been the focus for institutions for a long time. But, based on some of the headlines I'm seeing, it looks like, there's some institutions where, tenure isn't necessarily maybe as protected as it used to be. So, I think for those, based on what I'm seeing for the institutions that are in the benchmarking consortium, it seems like the focus is still on administration, but we do have some of our institutions that are using the data in order to be able to say, we're as lean as we possibly can be, and taking that data to the provost and saying, there's no more that we can do in terms of getting leaner. Have to be some changes on the academic side of the house in order to try to kind of optimize the labor spend across the institution. I don't know that necessarily is a threat to pursuing a career in academia. I think the goal for institutions that we work with, is to be able to invest more in the mission of the university, which is to serve students. And that's where, academia obviously plays such a vital role. And, but I do think that some of the institutions that we have we see them asking questions about, what is the labor mix of our academic employees? What are the ratios of graduate assistants to, say, faculty members, and how does that compare to other institutions? So I do think that institutions are trying to get a better handle on how they're staffed, even on the academic side of the house. But I don't necessarily think that's a a threat, at least as it stands currently, for pursuing a career in academia.
So I think Joe was going to kick it to me to close it, but since I'm kind of here.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you, Ranjani, for the talk and for the story. And I think there was a lot of food for thought there. And I'll kick it back to Heather, who can tell us what's up next in our day of programming.
Yeah, so I want to also say thank you so much. This is us working in this space. It's something I'm super interested in, so it was helpful to hear. And I really appreciate how you actually applied your own experience to some sort of lessons for people who are thinking about this going forward too. Yes, we're going to take a break. And for our attendees, we have 2 more panels coming up this afternoon. There will be one that's on research in the private sector, which you could have easily been a panelist on. So that starts at 2:30. And then followed by that, we have a panel on science communication. Please join us later this afternoon if you'd like to see more. And thank you very much, Ranjani. That was really helpful.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I just shared my contact information in the chat too, if anybody wants to reach out with any questions or to talk further. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Bye-bye.